I was watching a video this morning from Suicide for Celluloid, and it was about presuppositionalism and worldviews, and how one of the aims of presuppositionalism, one of the claims I suppose, is that they have a coherent worldview. And the idea that anybody should have a coherent worldview, if I understood that video correctly, is itself an incoherent idea. Well, none of us have a single coherent worldview. We all shift worldviews according to circumstance and according to what we're trying to understand. And that claim that presuppositionists sometimes make, either overtly or covertly, it can't be supported really. And one of the things that you mentioned there, Suicide for Celluloid, is that you were differentiating what you were saying to a God of the gaps argument. You were basically saying that different worldviews, of course, produce slightly different images and different understandings, and some of these understandings might be in conflict with one another. They produce glitches in the system, and the response, as you said, of presuppositionists in particular, is to kind of pull the rug over that and just kind of hand that over, outsource those glitches to God. And you were right, I think, to say that that's not exactly the same as a God of the gaps argument. I'm thinking of it as a kind of God of the glitches argument. If there is a glitch in your worldview, produced probably by the moire pattern that's happening when you try to overlay one view on top of another, when there's a glitch, you just kind of hand that over to God. You say, oh, that's God moving in mysterious ways, or it's not for us to question those kind of incompatibilities. That's part of the worldview. God is like that. God has these glitches. He's a kind of Ubu Roi kind of God, an Alfred Jarry God that's just incoherent. But it did make me think about the God of the glitches and how that might operate, because I have a kind of equivalent myself, a God of the glitches. Kind of. Because certainly in terms of something like consciousness studies, or understanding of how the brain works, and particularly how something like understanding works. What is this sense that we have when we come to understand something? There's in consciousness studies, there's a group of people there who are sometimes kind of semi-derogatorily called the Mysterions, which basically means that yes, there's an explanatory gap between the understanding that we have of how brain science operates and all of the kind of nest of research around cognitive science. There's an explanatory gap between that and the phenomenological experience of consciousness. The one doesn't seem to explain the other. It's also, it's part of that hard problem that David Chalmers talks about. And the Mysterions would say, I'm trying to think of their names, that doesn't matter, does it? The Mysterions would say, well, that explanatory gap is an inevitable part of being who we are. We don't have the cognitive apparatus to understand our own cognitive apparatus, or at least we don't have enough cognitive apparatus to understand the relationship between that cognitive apparatus and its effects. A computer can't instantiate itself inside itself, you know what I mean? If you do emulation if you try to emulate one machine inside another, the one that you emulate is inevitably less powerful. So when we try to understand consciousness by creating a model of it in our consciousness to understand, then we fail. Something like that. So the Mysterions say we'll never understand the explanatory gap. We might know all of the mechanisms, but we'll never get that gratifying feeling of understanding, because that understanding is itself the thing we're trying to understand. We can't emulate it. I think my understanding is the thinking of that comes a little bit out of kind of the evolution of consciousness, evolution of cognition, really. Here we are, middle-sized creatures moving at middle speed, as Dawkins says. And we have the brains and the minds, and presumably the consciousness appropriate to that. Our brains and minds and consciousness is very good at doing certain things, at moving middle-sized objects around, dogs and benches and trees, and bringing in harvest and bringing down animals and all that kind of stuff. the things that we've needed hundreds of thousands of years to get good at, our brains have got good at. But here we are now, you know, somehow with these minds that are capable of something like abstract thought, you know, using figurative thought, you know, the metaphors and synecdoche and all that, and metonymy and all that kind of stuff, and using language. Here we are with these minds that seem to be doing that, but they're inadequate to the task of trying to genuinely understand certain things, including, as I say, themselves. So there's always going to be explanatory gaps, and there's always going to be glitches in our ways of understanding, because we use these things like metaphor and metonymy and figurative thought in order to be able to understand abstract concepts. There's always going to be glitches. You know, we may not feel inclined to draw the God rug over them and hand them over to the God of the glitches, but we do other things instead. You know, we have this, you know, in physics, for example, simple physics, is the electron a wave or a particle? It depends how you look at it. You know, these are the equivalent of incompatible worldviews, aren't they? And they produce glitches in our thinking. We can treat it as one, or we can treat it as the other. We can apply different models to one and to the other, different toy versions of worldviews to these things. But there's a glitch. If we try to understand it coherently, consistently as a single thing, it produces a glitch. You know, and we could respond to that by saying, well, these waves don't exist, it's just particles. That's not true. And we can deny it by saying, well, particles don't exist, it's just waves. And that's not true either. The fact is, these are different ways of looking, aren't they? So we hand it over to, not to the God of the glitches so much, but to the mysterion of the glitches. We just kind of shrug our shoulders, or at least I do. Oh, well, it's as close as we get. Or the free will determinism thing. Free will and determinism. There's very good evidence that we live in a completely determined universe, but there's very good evidence that everything we do, and our whole social system, legal system, every other system we have as human beings is built on the fact that we are free agents. So it's a glitch. You know, they're incompatible systems. And they're probably incompatible for very similar reasons to waves and particles being incompatible. They're whatever is at work there, it's not something we can understand. We can do the science on it and produce mathematical ideas. We can do the sociology on it, or the poetry on it, and produce phenomenological human-centered ideas. But there's again an explanatory gap there, isn't there? Where we can lean towards free will if we're trying to adjudicate a case in law, and we can lead toward determinism if we're doing something else. Just different ways of doing the same thing. That's a glitch. I mean, we can't hand it over to God, so we hand it over to the mysterions, or we just again shrug our shoulders. I suppose in the past people did hand it over to God, didn't they? Because free will is something that God gave us, but God being omniscient it also implies that we live in a preordained, predetermined, predestined universe, don't we? So right within faith traditions there is this equivalent of the free will determinism glitch, the free will predestination glitch, particularly in something like Calvinism, where they have the idea of the elect. If I understand it correctly, in Calvinism some of us are born elected to go to heaven, and some of us are born elected to burn in hell for all eternity, and it's as written in stone as the most deterministic version of physics. And yet we have free will. We can choose to sin or not, and somehow by some magical power that relates to how we go, whether we're elect or not, but who knows what that relationship is. It's just a glitch. We hand it over to the God of the glitches, and again say he moves in mysterious ways. Yeah. Big fat glitch.